Hello, everybody. Welcome to another episode of Transfigured. I am here again with Dr. Kegan Chandler, but it has been a while. I think many years ago, I forget exactly how many, probably 3 or 4 years ago, you were on my channel. You were one of my earliest interviews, I think within my first 5 interviews. And we talked about your book, Constantine and the Divine Mind, I believe. Am I getting that title right?
Yep.
Mind-blowing book about Constantine. I'll have a link to that episode in the show notes. But for those who don't know, Dr. Kegan Chandler has a PhD in religious studies from the University of Copenhagen. As I mentioned, he is the author of that book about
Cape Town.
Cape Town. Did I say what did I say? Did I say University of Constantine?
No, Copenhagen.
I said University of Copenhagen, University of Cape Town. Yes, those two places are very close, are actually very related. I was trying to come up with some connection there. University of Cape Town. You're currently a researcher at the Center for the Study of Asian Religions in the Department of the Study of Religions at the University of Cape Town. And you are the vice chairman of the Unitarian Christian Alliance. I've known Kegan for many years through Unitarian events and Unitarian conferences and stuff like that. And there are just a lot of awesome YouTube videos with Kegan in them. You've been presenting, at conferences and stuff like that for many years. So if you just search Kegan Chandler in the YouTube browser, you can find some awesome lectures. Like, I would highly recommend his stuff about sort of Gnosticism, Hermeticism, and the Gospel of John. If you wanted to, learn about the connections between Hermeticism, and the Corpus Hermeticum, and all of that fun stuff, and Hermes Trismegistus. Anyway, Kegan is one of those just voracious autodidacts who knows a lot about subjects both broad and narrow. And what we're going to be focusing on tonight is that Kegan has been doing a lot of research recently on Japanese religion and Christianity in Japan. You have an upcoming book on the subject, and then you also have a new YouTube channel / podcast where you are discussing these things. Remind me the title of your YouTube channel exactly.
Yeah, it's Exploring Religion. But
Exploring Religion with Dr. Kegan Chandler.
Right. It does have an emphasis on East Asian traditions and Christianity, but I left it as Exploring Religion to keep my options as open as possible.
Keep your options open. Yeah. Well, I've really been enjoying your content there. It's relatively new. I think you only have about 8 or 10 episodes out so far. So definitely check that out. Being on the ground floor on a new, very interesting, fascinating podcast. So what I want to ask you, Kegan, is, of all the things to study in the world, well, how did you get interested in Japanese religion, Japanese religious movements, and Christianity in Japan?
Yeah, sure. Great question. And if I didn't say so earlier, thanks for inviting me on, Sam. It has been a while. I think it's actually been closer to 5 years or so since that Constantine book came out at the end of 2019. So a lot has happened since then, certainly. But really happy to be here. To answer your question, how did I get started studying about religion in Japan? Most people have told me that I have a penchant for trying to do the hardest thing possible in the hardest way possible. And so I thought there's nothing more difficult than religion in Japan. So why not? No, I'm kidding. The truth is that I've really been interested and studying Japan and Japanese history and culture since I was a child, which according to some people would be as recent as yesterday. But it's really since elementary school, I had been asking for and reading books about Japanese history and culture, and also about the history and culture of China as well. I've had a strong interest in both Japan and China since I was young. I was probably a very strange child. At least for our neighborhood.
Which of us weren't? Who among us was not a strange, geeky, nerdy child that is choosing to listen to this podcast voluntarily?
That's probably right. I think this is probably a circle of trust. But I began collecting Japanese and Chinese media. I still have literally hundreds and hundreds of Chinese and Japanese films and books and other things. I probably have over 1,000 Chinese and Japanese language films on DVD and VHS. So those countries and their cultures and their media have always been fascinating to me. But in terms of seriously studying Japanese and Chinese religions and philosophy, prior to my PhD, I'd been studying Christianity. I was raised Christian as a Protestant, and I'd done a Master of Theology, and my historical research had focused largely on Christianity and Greco-Roman traditions, as you mentioned earlier, Gnostic patterns of thought, including Hermeticism and some other things. But eventually a clear trend developed for me. I began focusing on monotheism, on the development and the transformation of monotheism in various global contexts. So I've published on monotheism and Christology in 4th century Rome, in early modern England, and ultimately these explorations of the concept and the category of monotheism took me to early modern Japan. I started studying Japanese Christianity, especially the Kakure Christan, or the hidden Christians of Japan, and eventually the Unitarian Christians of Japan in the early modern period. Eventually, that pushed me towards studying all of the problems associated with monotheism in Japan, and that's a whole nother subject. And exploring that led me into a specific interest in Japan's new religious movements, or what we call the Shinshukyo. And some of the early of these movements, which can fall into that category, have controversially been pinned with the monotheism label. So eventually I decided to do a PhD in Japanese religions, and I sought out an expert in the field whose work I appreciated at UCT, which is Cape Town, not Copenhagen. And that was Professor Elisabetta Porcu. And she thought some of my ideas had potential, had some American spunk to them. You might call it that. Some places today might call it something else. But Professor Porcu was willing to put up with me and my big controversial ideas, and so the rest is history. As you mentioned, I'm still working in the Center for the Study of Asian Religions at UCT, and still publishing. And I have a new book coming out, Monotheism in the New Religious Movements of Japan, which should be coming out from Routledge later this year, probably this summer. So it's been an interesting journey so far, and I think it's far from over.
Great. So can tell me a little bit about sort of like the deep history of religion in Japan? Like what are some of the early origins of religion in Japan, and Confucianism and Shintoism and Buddhism and its connections to mainland China, or its differences from mainland China? What's sort of like that kind of early far back history of religion in Japan like?
Yeah, so this is a really challenging subject. I don't think anyone on your viewers list can handle the deep history as you asked for, but I'll try to simplify this as much as possible. And really, I think it might help to talk about religion in Japan as it's currently conceptualized, right? Because some of your listeners might be unaware of this. Even the phrase religion in Japan would be controversial. Okay, there's a whole movement within my field of religious studies that might say that that's problematic. That if you look far back enough in history, that there isn't something that you can find called religion. So this is very tough. So I think if it's okay with you, I might start from what we mean by religion in Japan today and what Japan thinks about religion, and then work back from there into those ancient periods.
Go for it.
So today, if you look at religion in Japan, right, most people might, if they want to know something about that, they might start with a survey. And they're going to see some very interesting things, which will hint at something very unique going on in Japan with regard to religion. You'll see some surveys and they will say, all right, 1% to 2% of the population is Christian, right? And by the way, it's about 2 million people, give or take, out of a country of 124 million. So, okay, Christianity 1 to 2%, and then you have something called Shinto, which is often described as the indigenous religion of Japan, for better or for worse. Shinto, you've got 80%. Okay, and then you've got Buddhism. Buddhism is 70%. All right, so I know
there's
you're
more than 100% of people live in Japan.
exactly. See, you are a Harvard man. You can count.
Yeah, I did learn statistics. Yeah.
So, problem there. Okay, but then it gets even more challenging, because you'll see some other surveys that say no religion, 88%. Okay, so on the one hand, we have a few different issues, right? We have what scholars call multiple religious belonging. There are people who have no problem in identifying with more than one religious tradition. That kind of an idea is somewhat strange to most Westerners who encounter it. In the West, heavily influenced by Christianity, we are used to identifying with a particular religion, claiming membership in a particular religion, being an exclusivist to some degree. That's not the case in Japan. But then on the other hand, you have this problem of people saying, well, I'm not religious. Yes, I'm going to Shinto shrines, I'm participating in Buddhist rituals and ceremonies, but that's not religion. It's not religious. So again, another cultural pattern, which most Westerners are going to scratch their heads at. Usually in the West, if people are going to church, things like that, you would say, oh, well, you're religious. I think the best way to talk about what's going on, and this will ultimately get at your question about what is Japanese religion. The best way to talk about this is, I think, to bring up two categories. One is the category of religion itself, and the other is to talk about this through the category of syncretism. So let's start with this first category, religion. Religion, the category itself, has had a very troubled, strange history in Japan. In the 1850s, this is the time precipitating the rapid modernization of Japan that we associate with a period we describe as the Meiji Restoration, which starts formally in 1868 with the restoration of the power of the emperor. But prior to that, you had the opening of the country, the forced opening of the country by the United States in the 1850s. And this introduced a whole host of Western influences into the country after it had been closed for a very long time under what are called the Sakoku edicts, right? The Sakoku means country in chains, or chained country. The country literally had been closed off for hundreds of years until the United States came and forced it open. But when this happened, they became introduced to all sorts of concepts and questions by Western missionaries, like, what religion are you? And this was quite strange to some people, to many Japanese, because the category of religion was understood by these Protestant influences in a very Western Protestant way. Religion to them meant something private. It's a private belief, an organized system of private belief. You have a God, you have a scripture, you have membership in this organization.
Self-identification and awareness of your self-identification and stuff like that.
Yes, and something focused really on belief,
yeah,
versus over and against the public's something that we do in public.
Mm-hmm.
This is, obviously owed to a separation of church and state. The idea that we can think one way and vote another. This is a very Western, liberal Protestant idea that was quite confusing to many of the Japanese at the time, who didn't have the line drawn so neatly and engaged in all sorts of public rituals and ceremonies, which, from another standpoint, we would identify as clearly religious. So this was an issue which eventually crystallized in the 1880s when the Japanese Constitution is being written, and they're having to decide, well, what is religion? What do we think about all of this? And they developed this term shukyo, which actually was a modification of a Buddhist term that basically means teaching. But this word shukyo became what corresponds to religion, and it's still used today. But the question is, what's going to fit into this word? So, um, again, there was a division between religion as something private versus something secular, and around this time, the Japanese government is coalescing power, and they're creating something called, that scholars now call, state Shinto. This is this was a maneuver by the Japanese government, as I mentioned, to consolidate power and to prop up the veneration of the emperor. Won't get into all the details there, but ultimately, the Japanese government officially pronounced that, well, state Shinto is not religion, because this is something that we're all doing publicly together, right?
Mhm.
We're doing these rituals. We're all venerating the emperor and the kokutai.
It's
So
patriotism or something, not
that's
religion.
right. It's a form of civil duty
Mhm.
that everybody's responsible for, and religion is this other thing. So the situation's already quite confused, right off the bat, from a few different directions. So um, uh, there is the government ultimately is pushing all of these different groups, including Christianity, including Buddhism and other forms of religion, various new religious movements. It's pushing them into this category of religion, or maybe even worse, a category of superstition for some traditions. Yeah, very, very confused situation. Now, today, this situation of this challenge of identifying religion in Japan is maybe even made more difficult by contemporary religious studies in the West. There is a movement that we call the critical study of religion, which essentially strongly cautions us against um, imposing Western categories onto non-Western cultural contexts. So, one of the things that they famously have done in Japan is to look back into the history of Japan and to recognize that, well, there's, until the invention of this term shukyo for religion, well, they didn't have that word in pre-modern Japan. And because they didn't have that word, well, religion must not exist, right? So religion is this social construct which Western Protestant forces came and projected onto this non-Western society. And so they look generally to undo that sort of thing. Or at the very least to strongly caution against the imposition of foreign terms. And I won't get into all of that too much, but there is another force, you could say, within my field of religious studies that's acted in the opposite direction. So, for example, Galen Amstutz has this line. He's a terrific scholar of Shin Buddhism. He says, well, really, the Japanese adoption of the term shukyo was really a liaison of convenience rather than a shotgun wedding. Right. This is a period in Japan in which there's a rapid modernization, and they're having to adapt to the West and to its categories and to this different way of thinking. And it just so happens that this word is, worked very well for them and could be applied to a cultural pattern that was pre-existing. And also, there's a fantastic article that I can recommend if people are interested in this subject by a scholar named Christoph Kleine. I believe the title was "Religion and the Secular in Pre-Modern Japan," and he shows that actually, just because there wasn't a word religion, there was a conceptual understanding, and he points to a bifurcation in Buddhist thought between this worldly and otherworldly matters, second and shusekken. Anyway, there's a lot of argumentation that's been done from the other direction, is my point, which establishes that there is something that we can identify as religion in Japan, a social pattern of behavior that corresponds to this religious secular divide, if you will. But anyway, that's a whole big field of debate. So the bottom line is from both there are historical forces and there are present day academic forces, which have really complicated the issue of religion in Japan and what it is. And all of this has made people, I think, a little bit unsure of what to do with this category, with these surveys of, are you religious? The other thing that has made people shy away from this category of religion in Japan, or from self-identifying with it, is the category is associated with proselytizing Christian groups, which are typically looked on unfavorably, and also with new religious movements, or what I called the Shinshukyo earlier. There were several public incidents of violence and other kinds of controversies that took place in Japanese society from the mid 90s onward, and even as recently as a couple of years ago. And these have continued to sour people on religious affiliation, belonging to a particular group, exclusivism, etc., which is not something generally that the Japanese religious consciousness has been amenable to. And that takes us into the discussion about syncretism and multiple belonging. Unless you had any questions or wanted to stop me there.
Like what this is making me think about is that I, from reading Tom Holland and his podcast, The Rest is History, like when British people were engaging with India, they would ask, what religion are you? And they didn't know how to answer that question either. And so the term Hinduism got applied, but Hinduism just means, what the Hindus do, and Hindu is just people of the Indus Valley. So it's just like the religion of the people who are over there. Now, it's certainly not like they didn't have religious rituals or priests or temples or these sorts of things, but it was something that, it's sort of like pointing out water to a fish. And that sort of situation. Whereas in the West, and also, the Middle East giving rise to the West, because there's a lot more intergroup conflict and group rivalry and various group identities competing with each other, and that group identity and religious identity often get, mixed together or are often the same thing. There's more awareness of those people over there do these sorts of things. We do these sorts of things. We disagree. We don't believe in their gods. They don't believe in our gods. And, that sort of thing. And that ripples from, Judaism into Christianity and all those sorts of things in Western history. But Japan is a uniquely, insular is the right word in both the literal and the figurative sense. Insular means of the islands. And so it's an island that has a lot of homogeneity to it. So you can imagine the idea of sort of like group identity rivalry just never really coming up in Japan, and it not and the whole idea that there would be different group identities is sort of against the homogeneity of Japan and how they think about themselves and how they want their society to even operate in the first place.
Yeah, you've brought up a lot of good topics. We could talk about several of these things for a long time. I'll just say this in response, that there has been a problem with what we could call East-West dichotomies. These are cross-cultural socio-political problems which have plagued the reception of religions and the study of religions. This is an ongoing problem to this day. And what I'm referring to is a cultural impulse to define one's own civilizational identity over and against that of another. So the West did this first, arguably, to Japan. When it came to Japan, it did everything it could to denigrate the Japanese, especially Japanese religion, particularly Shinto, and to present itself, Western Christianity, as more of the the apex of religion. And a lot of this has to do with older anthropological narratives, which were popular at the time, which were predicated on an evolutionary model of religions. So, for example, I'm thinking of Sir Edward Tyler, Tylor, if people want to look all this up. There's the basic pattern that the West assumed at this time when it engaged with Japan, in which religion starts off as some mere animism, and then it moves into a polytheism. From there, it moves into a henotheism. From there, it's monotheism, and then perhaps atheism represents the most enlightened form of humanity. So
A very ironic end to the evolution of
yes.
religion, but
So the West comes in and is working this way, and there are economic, cultural dominance motivations at play here as well. And so the response of Japan to this kind of an approach is a very understandable one, but it seeks to assert its own form of cultural chauvinism. Right, where it says, well, actually, the Japanese culture and Japanese religion is what is best, and this is an ongoing situation to this day. There is an entire field of scholarship in Japan which promotes this unique view of Japan, and a view of Japanese cultural identity. As something which stands over and against that of the West. If people are interested, there's a famous book by a scholar named Peter Dale from 1986 called Myths of Japanese Uniqueness. I won't go further into that, but it's very fascinating. So this is, my point is, this is an ongoing problem, and I write about the problem of East-West dichotomies in my forthcoming book, and I've also published some articles on this situation. Sometimes scholars refer to this problem as a problem of Orientalism versus Occidentalism. This is essentially a pattern of thought, or a pattern of engaging other cultures, which essentializes these cultures and contrast them with other cultures, right? So these are oversimplifications of cultures and of religions for purposes of denigrating the other. All of this is standing behind these questions, like, what is religion in Japan? Why don't people identify as religious in Japan? Was there something called religion in Japan in the pre-modern era? It's hard to engage these questions without also understanding the long history of East-West cultural engagement and the way that scholars have reacted to these challenges.
Sure, but one could still ask the question, well, how did Buddhism get to Japan, and how did that change things? And then maybe I'll ask about Buddhism first, but then we can shift to like Christianity in Japan sort of after that, because these things have happened to Japan prior to American missionaries on boats with guns telling you to open up your country.
Yeah, certainly. This is where we can talk about that other category I mentioned, syncretism. And I'll first say that syncretism is a controversial category in the study of religions, right? Some scholars say the category of syncretism has no taxonomic value because they would recognize that blending and borrowing processes are basic to the construction of religions, and it's actually basic to the predicament of culture in general. And I would agree with that. At the same time, I find room for the term syncretism for conscious processes of blending and borrowing, no matter how guilty various religions may be of blending and borrowing. So when I'm using this word syncretism, I'm very well aware of the scholarly controversies around it, but I do still think it's useful for referring to a style of engagement, a cross-cultural engagement and interreligious engagement, which has not been so clearly, which hasn't been so obvious in the history of Christianity, although blending and borrowing certainly hasn't taken place, but not in the same way that it has been typical of Japanese and Chinese religions. So I think if we talk about this, we'll talk about how all these other aspects of Japanese religion, like Buddhism. There is an old saying in Japan that goes like this: Shinto is the root of the Japanese tree. Confucianism is its trunk. and Buddhism is its blossoming flower. And I always say that I'm pretty sure a Buddhist came up with that phrase. But there is an idea in Japan that something called Shinto came first. I mentioned earlier, Shinto is sometimes, or very often, described as the indigenous religion of Japan. And it's true that something called Shinto, or perhaps proto-Shinto, can be identified in the earlier periods of Japan. And then it's around the 400s CE that Confucianism enters Japan. And then it's in 538, we can be a little bit more particular with that. In 538 CE, Buddhism enters Japan. And this is coming from China through Korea into the Japanese islands. But when these movements are being introduced to Japan, it's not like people are stopping what they're doing and turning to something else, right? They have a very different understanding of incorporation, right? So in the West, and this is one of the things, if you remember, that I focused on in my Constantine book, which is largely about Constantine's religious conversion. In the West, we think about conversion through this very Augustinian and Pauline lens. Really, Augustine, Paul, and Constantine, those stories really dominate our Western conception of what it means to adopt a religion. And this is also can be detected in the older paradigm in the psychology of religious conversion as well, where we talk about a sudden 180-degree turn, right? I was doing this, I stopped doing that and started doing something else. So there's a particular moment in time when this happens. In Japan, there is a process of blending and incorporation, which is much different. And this is part of the, what we can get into earlier about why the Christian missionaries had quite a hard time in Japan, because they're demanding exclusive adherence to turn from the Kamis and the Buddhas toward the Christian God, whereas the Japanese were more interested in incorporation rather than exclusivity. The Japanese religious landscape since the 400s and 500s has been rather diverse. It can be characterized by Shinto, which essentially is the worship of kami or spirits. Spirits, gods, or deities is how you could translate that term. And you can see many Shinto shrines if you go to Japan, although there's a lot of historical argument about the continuity between what we call Shinto today and maybe what was in the ancient periods. We won't get into that. But as I mentioned, there's also Confucianism. Confucianism was has been in the country for a very long time, but it was during the Tokugawa shogunate. So since the 1600s until the 1860s, this Confucianism was brought in and deliberately manhandled by the government and used as a system of social order. Obviously, Buddhism, as we've talked about, has not had an entirely untroubled history in Japan. There have been periods of persecution of Buddhism in Japan, which is a very interesting subject. But today, obviously, you heard me say earlier, many of Japan's much of Japan's population identifies with Buddhism, or at least participates in Buddhist rituals. There has also been various folk traditions which have existed. For example, we might reference traditions like Shugendo, which is a form of mountain worship. There's also been, since the 1800s, what we can call Kokugaku Shinto, which is a sort of nationalist Shinto. And by the way, many of them are monotheist, or so I argue in my forthcoming book. Around this time in the 1800s, there's also something that a form of religion we can call Shingaku. These are popular Confucian-inspired movements. And then there's also this whole category called the new religious movements of Japan, or the Shinshukyo, which is a very colorful category of lots of diverse traditions. So I could go on and on, Sam, but the Japanese religious landscape is very diverse, and many of these traditions are functioning in this very way it'll be pretty peculiar to most people in the West when they encounter it, in which they're living in harmony together, they're influencing one another, they're being consciously and unconsciously blended and borrowed together. And this is something which Japan historically has had no issue with.
And so, what is the history of Christianity in Japan? And I've read yay or nay on whether Nestorian or Assyrian Church of the East missionaries ever got to Japan. I know that they got to maybe central China. That's pretty uncontested. But I don't
Right.
know if, like, say, in the 6th, 7th, or 8th century, if they got all the way to Japan. But then, I mean, I've watched Shogun like any good Netflix account owning person should, and Blue-Eyed Ninja and stuff like that. So I know that these American Protestant evangelicals are not the first Christians to get there, that the Portuguese and the Jesuits have an important role. So what's the history of Christianity in Japan?
Yeah, the question about ancient Nestorians is an interesting one. I'm not familiar with any evidence in that regard. Um, Something to note is that our written records of Japanese history are not as old as you might think.
Hmm.
So our earliest Japanese written records comes from the early 700s. That's the 700 CE.
Yeah.
Right? So these documents are very late compared to, say, the histories of China.
Yeah.
So really, the starting point for the verifiable story of Christianity in Japan is going to start in the mid 1500s. So in 1549, as you just briefly mentioned, Francis Xavier is a Jesuit missionary, and he comes over and begins spreading Catholicism in the country. And this is the start of a long, troubled history of Christianity in Japan. Eventually, though, arguably Xavier has some success in, the first 100 years or so. They call it the Christian century. But there was lots of problems too that we could get into in terms of, well, some of the issues that we just talked about, particularly exclusivity is a big issue. The conceptual understanding between the Jesuits and especially the Shingon Buddhists who are operating in the area where they came on land. But eventually, they began winning converts, and the Christian missions ultimately became implicated in some political intrigue, at least in the mind of the Tokugawa shogunate. And so, around in the early 1600s, the government begins to crack down on Christianity. And there's lots of reasons that have been proposed for why this is. Part of it certainly has to do with the fear that Western Christian missions are going to be used in a subversive way, by foreign governments. If you look at what happened to the Philippines, you might say, well, I don't want that to happen to us. So they began progressively through a series of edicts banning Western missionaries, and ultimately Westerners and Western influence in general, outlawing the Kirishtan, as they would call them, and persecuting Christianity rather harshly. If people are interested in this, they may be interested in watching the film by Martin Scorsese. There's an adaptation of a famous Japanese novel called Silence. This is a book written by Catholic author Endo Shusaku, and it's about the persecution of the Christians in Japan during this period, and some Jesuit padres who sneak back into the country. I won't spoil it. A story not for the faint of heart, but it's a good entry point, I think, for people if they're wanting to at least get a little sense of the atmosphere, of Japan and the situation of Christianity at that time. But the most interesting part of this story is ultimately what happened afterwards. So, and I mean much afterwards. So again, the country was closed down through Sakoku at this time, and Christianity, was a defeated organism in the country. It was completely dead, in my opinion. In fact, you can find some government Confucian scholars, for example, Ogyu Sorai, very famous. And at one point he says, look, we're all sitting here arguing about Christianity, like what you might do if you're a Confucian or a Buddhist scholar at that time and you didn't like your opponent, you could accuse them of being a Christian. But Ogyu Sorai says, what does that even mean? There aren't even any Christian books around that the government allows us to look at. So we don't even know what Christians really think anymore. And we're all calling each other, well, you're a Christian. I think that, and Ogyu Sorai was, extremely well positioned, and yet even he was denied from seeing this collection of outlawed books.
So the extermination campaign was quite effective.
Most effective, right?
Yeah.
And so the West, they imagine, well, there's no Christianity left in the country, right? But incredibly, what does happen in the 1850s? So once the country begins to open up to the West again, there are missionaries who return. So famously, there's a French Catholic missionary named Bernard Petitjean, and he goes to Nagasaki, and the government allows him to begin constructing a church. So if, foreigners were, once they were allowed in, they had freedom to practice their own religion, right? But they couldn't interfere with Japanese religions. So he begins constructing this church, thinking, all right, it's time to start the work of God once more on these islands. And lo and behold, to his surprise, a group of Kakure Christian, or the hidden Christians, approach him, and they famously whisper to him, we have the same God as you. Our heart is the same as yours. And he says, what do you mean? Surely not. Surely you're not Christians. And what they reveal is that there actually had been secret communities of Christians who had been hiding for hundreds of years in Japan beneath harsh persecution.
Wow.
They had quietly kept their faith alive, having no missionaries, no padres, or batoren, as they would call them.
No churches.
No churches, no scriptures, no Bibles, no nothing. These people had passed on small relics that they would, keep and they would keep in hiding, little bits and shreds of Christian theology and stories that they would keep alive through oral tradition. It's really amazing. So, for example, just to help people get an image of how they were doing this. There might be an image of a female bodhisattva. For example, Canon or Guanyin. This is bodhisattva. So it's this female Buddhist deity when the government inspectors arrive, but when they leave, now it's the Virgin Mary. Right.
Yeah.
So they're able to hide and conceal their faith. And what Bernard Petitjean discovers, is of course not just a Christianity. He says, well, they believe in the Trinity and in the virgin birth and in everything, just like any good French Catholic does. I'm not so sure about that. If you look at their writings, we do have a document tradition for Kakure Christian writings. That's called the Tenchi Hajimari no Koto, or the beginnings of the heaven and earth. And this is a story that was passed on, and there are several different variations and different manuscript traditions among the different Christian communities, some of which are still barely in existence. And there you find a Catholic doctrine transformed. Right. So you have what appears to be a Genesis creation narrative, and then it turns into a story about how God wants to save human beings. And now you find the doctrine of the Trinity, but it's not the Trinity like you've seen it before. An angel turns to God and to the Father and says, I think you need to save people. I have an idea how you can do it. You can split your body into three. That's how you can save them. And the Father says, this is a brilliant idea. Right. So you have this, the God Emperor in three bodies, right? So it's very, very interesting, and also the Holy Spirit. I think you'll get a kick out of this. The Holy Spirit is actually replaced in the Kakure Trinity with the Virgin Mary. Okay, so it's the Father, the Son.
Not surprising, Muhammad, though. Because there's that verse in the Quran where God has taken to himself his son and Mary and made them sort of like three gods. Yeah.
You're right. Now you can understand how this happened,
Yeah.
because, well, as some Protestant pastors will tell you about the Holy Spirit today, it's the shy member of the Trinity.
Yeah.
Right? We don't really talk about him or focus on him too much. Meanwhile, Mary is certainly forefronted in the Jesuit, tradition that these Japanese inherited. So you can see how they make that switch. But in my forthcoming book on monotheism and the new religious movements of Japan, I have an entire chapter on Kakure Christian theology, which is sort of a historical and theological excursus in the book, if people are interested in that. But the bottom line is that you have this incredible story of, I think, the perseverance of the human spirit. These people were able to carry on this tradition as best they could through incredible circumstances. And so once,
Orally and hidden, and for 200 plus years. Wow.
yeah, it's really incredible and an inspiring and fascinating story. And so, from one vantage point, you could say that Christianity never left
No.
Japan since Francis Xavier first came on shore at Kagoshima. Of course, if you take a particular view of what Christianity is, if you forefront doctrinal accuracy and orthodoxy, perhaps then you might say something else. But anyway, so from this point to continue with the history of Christianity, in the 1850s, Protestant missionaries enter the country. And this is where things get really, really interesting. Protestant forces come in of all different stripes, from Baptists to Methodists to liberal German Protestants, all kinds of groups enter in. And this is where Christianity begins to meet the intellectual substrate of Japan. And some really fascinating things happen here, including an interest in Unitarianism, which I know is a subject that you're interested in as well. So I'll just talk about one particular aspect of this. I'll go towards the Unitarian path, since that'll probably be a good topic for us. So what you need to understand about this wave of Japanese converts is that this is a period of acute modernization. This is this is 1850s, 1860s, headed towards the beginning of or the end of the century. This is a period of incredible social upheaval, of intellectual turmoil. When Commodore Matthew Perry arrived in 1853 with the black ships, as they call them, they were literally painted black, with billowing black smoke, the devil's ships. When he arrived in Tokyo Bay, this was a total shock to the Japanese collective consciousness. The Japanese people began to understand that they were behind technologically, that the Tokugawa government had not done them any favors. And so there was a lot of fear and doubt and uncertainty and overall anxiety. And segments of Japanese society were pulling in all sorts of cultural influences. They were reading translations of John Stuart Mill. So there were, utilitarian ideas coming into the country right alongside of these Protestant missions. You had the theory of evolution enters the country and starts causing havoc with people. And again, because these are all ideas which are conflicting with their Buddhist and Shinto heritages as well in various ways. So there is a lot going on, and I want to just paint that picture that this is not just about Christianity coming in and dealing with Buddhism. There's a lot of ideas.
It's Christianity, it's the Enlightenment, it's Western science, it's technology, it's democracy, it's all of it.
Right, and so for our particular subject we want to focus on, we can start by looking at how liberal Protestantism enters in. Right. So there was I'm blanking on the name of the association. It was a German Evangelical Association, forgetting the full name, but this is part of the liberal Protestant tradition. And this ends up being a kind of Christianity that for many of the Japanese intellectuals of the period was much more attractive than the so-called Orthodox Christianity of what you might, as you might find in, say, what the Baptist missionaries were preaching, right? So this liberal Protestant tradition is understood to be modern. It's understood to be aligned with rational thought. And these are ideas which, these are realms of thought which are gaining currency in this rapidly modernizing Japan. So eventually in 1873, Christianity becomes legalized. My understanding is that this is partly because the Meiji government wanted to align with Western norms. It wanted to foster diplomatic, relations with these Western powers, which are predominantly Christian. And so this really opens the floodgates for these Japanese intellectuals who are interested in these liberal Protestant ideas to really start exploring and start to begin to be very vocal. So probably there's an event that's worth talking about. This is called, there's a group of Christian converts that we call the Kumamoto Band. And these group of converts, many of them heavily influenced by this liberal Protestant tradition, they would go on to have significant influence amongst Christian churches, even among Christian churches that we wouldn't necessarily, call liberal. This was in 1876, so just several years after Christianity was legalized, and it was about, I believe it was 35 students or so. These were men who had been educated by an American teacher. The teacher's name was Leroy Janes. There was a hunger for Western learning, right? And so he was a teacher who had set up, Western learning academy, and he would also tell them about Christianity. So this is where these guys are getting exposed to these ideas. And eventually they decide to convert. They ascend this mountain, Mount Hanaoka, and they all swear this oath to the Christian God. It's this big dramatic event. And this event caused a lot of controversy. They ended up shutting down the school. But these guys, they were quite brave, quite inspiring. And from this group, you would have many of the people that would ultimately become Unitarian Christians, although not all of them, but many of them would be. And so even though Unitarianism formally, remained kind of small in Japan, the influence of these particular leaders on Japanese churches was immense. So these are names like Ebina Danjo, Uemura Masahisa, Kozaki Hiramachi, Uchimura Kanzo. Many of these prominent converts actually share a lot in common, and it helps to explain why they were interested in Unitarianism if you understand a little bit about their background. So many of these gentlemen are the son of samurai. Their fathers, were samurai. And so they are raised against this backdrop of, a rigid social order in which, they're trained to serve a feudal lord. And at the same time, being educated members of this class, they're deeply immersed in Confucianism, which again was part of the orthodoxy that the government had set up. At the same time, many of them are nationalists as well. Not surprising during this period, but Confucianism, nationalism, these kinds of views are what's going to stay with them and to flavor the kind of liberal Protestantism that they ultimately adopt and make them very friendly to forms of Unitarianism. And I can get into all that in a little bit, but eventually the Unitarian missions come in. And by Unitarian missions, I mean the explicitly Unitarian organizations, right? So there's the American Unitarian Association, which is headquartered in Boston at this time. There's also a British Foreign Unitarian Association, but really, when we talk about Japan, we're talking about the American Unitarian Association and their mission there. They were actually called in by the Japanese.
Interesting.
And so it's clear to me that influence of liberal Protestantism had already been at work amongst people like the leaders I'm referring to, and they had already been therefore disinterested in certain allegedly core Christian doctrines, like the doctrine of the Trinity, the doctrine of the deity of Christ, and various other supernatural, if you will, traditional doctrines. Excuse me. And so these kind of Christians were frustrated with what the mainline Protestant missionaries were giving them, and they heard about the American Unitarian Association, and they asked them to come and to bring them this Christianity that they understood was free from superstition, as they would call it, and that prioritized rationalism, and that saw Christianity as a moral system. They were very interested in these ideas. The other thing, and getting back to the idea of syncretism, they saw many of these other Protestant missions as being very exclusivist, very dogmatic, right? They would hear from, for example, the Baptist missionaries that, no, these are the core Christian doctrines, and if you don't believe in these doctrines, then you're not a Christian. And if you're going to be a Christian, then you need to be a Christian and therefore stop being, a Confucianist or participating in Shinto or anything else. It's the same old problem of exclusivism. When they heard about Unitarianism, and they thought this was going to be a less dogmatic approach to Christianity, right? Because Unitarians at this time were preaching, the fatherhood of God and the universal brotherhood of man and all of that. So in 1887, the American Unitarian Association sends a reverend named Arthur Knapp. He was a Harvard man like you.
Imagine that. Yeah.
Yeah. And so Arthur Knapp, he comes and begins helping them out, and they start publishing and getting really active in the country. And so there's a Unitarian movement that emerges, and through all of this activity, there are some public controversies. There are some of these now decidedly, Unitarian Japanese Christians who are being kicked out of the Evangelical Alliance, or they're resigning, they're turning in their card over doctrinal differences. There are public debates. In fact, the very first, what scholars identify as the very first public debate in Japanese Christianity of this period was over the deity of Christ. Over the doctrine of the Trinity. This is a public debate between the Unitarian Christian Ebina Danjo and the Trinitarian Uemura Masahisa. So a lot of activity, very, very fierce, very fast, and it really probably peaked in the around 1900 or so, and then started to dwindle. And the American Unitarian mission ended in sometime in the 1920s. I'm forgetting exactly when they left, but so Arthur Knapp's visit was a success, right? In terms of supporting or stirring up, this pre-existing sentiment amongst these Japanese Christians, which was really hell bent on a few things. First, not swallowing every single traditional foundational core Christian doctrine that the Western missionaries said Christianity was all about. And at the same time, it was all of this was causing them to understand that they had a need for a Japanese Christianity. So I mentioned that they were nationalists, right? And so you see this very peculiar form of Christianity developing, which is liberal Protestant. Many of them are Unitarians. They're strongly nationalists, and all of this coalesces together, and they start producing explicit Japanese Christianities. They see that what's incumbent upon them, if Christianity is to survive in their country, is to have a Japanese Christianity for the Japanese. There is a famously Kanzo. He has this phrase that he's very famous for: the two J's. He promoted the two J's, Jesus and Japan. And they were both very, very, very important to him. I can go on in terms of their beliefs, or anything else you want to talk about. But
well, what happened to them? Did they sort of fizzle out? Does World War II change everything? What
yeah,
sort of happened with that sort of
question.
liberal Protestantism and Unitarianism in Japan?
Yeah, good question. So I think we should first understand it's very fragmented, right?
Yeah.
The actual Unitarian churches founded by some of these guys, they remain very small. As I mentioned, it's the influence of the leadership, which is great in Japan, right?
Yeah.
Not the community building itself.
It's a common pattern in Unitarianism is a slight struggle to organize ourselves, but still somehow an undue intellectual influence way beyond proportion.
Yeah,
It's a common pattern.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. You could win all the debates, but then what?
We can win all the debates, we can win the culture, we can set huge directions for intellectual trajectory, but we sometimes struggle to keep our churches going.
Yeah, that's right. But the situation of Unitarian Christianity in Japan is certainly, I think, much more complicated even than what was going on, in New England and America. But part of this is early on. It's so fragmented. So I mentioned some of these names earlier of the people. So, for example, you have Kanzo, who I just mentioned, the guy with the two J's, Jesus in Japan. Right, this guy, he's influenced on the one hand by some liberal Protestant ideas, right? But he ends up taking all of this in a very unique direction, where he promotes something called the Mukyokai, or this is the non-church movement, right? Where he wants to have a church that is free of dogmas, of creeds, don't put us in any four walls. So a movement like that is inherently unstable, right?
No.
And then you have, others I mentioned, like Ebina Danjo, who's my personal favorite and the one I've studied the most. And characters like this, they begin to push very strongly for this nationalist towards the end of his career. Very nationalistic type of Christianity, which doesn't sit well with some people. So there's just so many issues on which people could divide and see things differently. And what ends up happening at the same time is that coalescence of state power in the form of state Shinto is happening at the beginning of the century. Right, which ultimately leads Japan, into its imperialistic model, and ultimately into World War II, and we know what happens there. So this nationalism really overwhelms, I think, a very fragmented and inherently unstable sort of loose movement of Unitarian Christians. The Unitarian mission leaves, like I mentioned, and so today you'll be hard pressed to find formal groups of Unitarian Christians in Japan. I've actually met with the Unitarian Universalist group in Tokyo. They still meet regularly, but in terms of their historical ties to any particular AUA excuse me, related congregation, I'm not so sure about that.
Yeah, they might have been a church planted by expats, or an expat church that then had some Japanese people in it or something like that.
Right. So as I mentioned at the beginning of our discussion, Christianity on the whole remains quite small, right? It's about, depending on the survey, right, it's between 1% to 2%, most likely about 1.5% of the population. It's about 1.9 million people, right? But in a country of 124 million people. So Christianity has continued to remain a minority movement, and that's all kinds of Christians together.
Yeah,
Right.
and of that near 2 million number of Japanese Christians, how many of them are Catholic?
I don't remember that statistic off the top of my head, right? But they're going to be in the minority,
They're
compared
in the
to.
minority. It is
Right.
majority, yeah, Protestant. Mhm.
Mhm. Yeah.
So among these Unitarian Japanese Christians, sort of at the end of the 19th century, were they sort of? I feel like there are two flavors of Unitarianism that happen, and you see this in Boston, you see this in other places. One I call sort of um, almost anti-supernaturalist Unitarianism that tends to really de-emphasize miracles, de-emphasize supernatural activity, and Jesus is sort of like a great moral teacher, but there's no real connection between him and the divine, and it sort of moves in a deistic kind of direction. And then there's sort of more, you could say, enchanted Unitarianism, but then it often moves in like a sense where the kind of like Ralph Waldo Emerson, or sort of some sort of transcendentalist, like there's divine in everybody, and that Jesus is sort of the preeminent example of divinity in all humanity, but it sort of like brings divinity everywhere, or something like that.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering, and how did that mix with any sort of native Japanese philosophies and theologies and stuff like that?
Yeah. Great question. And if those are the two paths that you've given me, I think to answer that with regard to these Japanese Unitarian Christians, we're going to have to travel down both of those paths at the same time.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay, so on the one hand, when you talk about this sort of rationalist Unitarian Christianity, which is suspicious of miracles and things like that, you can definitely detect that in some of these figures. They have no problem throwing out doctrines which they think don't make any sense, which are
Mhm.
irrational or unscientific to them. There's really a strong emphasis on the moral teachings and the moral character of Jesus as a focal point. They are happy to dispense with many stories of supernatural happenings in the biblical text. They'll be quite on the nose with that, saying rather explicitly there are some parts of the biblical documents that are spectacular and some that we should just leave behind.
Mhm.
And a lot of times that seems to be on this sort of supernaturalist grounds. So that's certainly there. At the same time, though, not for transcendentalist reasons, but there is a strong sense of the divinity within being a focal
Mhm.
point as well. And this is because of the Confucian background, right? And also, the influence of Shinto and Buddhism as well, but specifically because of the Confucian philosophical background, um, which is coloring the understanding and the approach to Christianity of many of these figures. And this is really fascinating for me. And I'll talk about that in 1 second. But the third part of your observation or your question was, how does it relate? How did these guys relate to these other indigenous traditions compared to Christianity? Certainly, there is an interest in harmonization there among many of
Mhm.
them. It is quite clear. There are some of these Christian converts, even some associated with liberal Protestant ideas, who were happy to sacrifice various aspects of their cultural heritage to adopt things like the Trinity or to try to and do all that. But there are many of these Unitarian Christians who are very explicit about a perceived compatibility between their indigenous religious consciousness and Christianity. And they see not only very often that some of their pre-existing cultural heritage is compatible with Christianity, but they see that the harmonization of these things is actually the next step in the evolution of humanity. They see
Interesting, yeah.
Japan, remember, through a very nationalistic lens, they see Japan as what is going to lead humanity into, this new age
The
of
city on
reason.
the hill. Yeah, it's not
Yeah,
Boston this time though. It's Tokyo or
right.
Osaka.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So,
Mhm.
for example, they might not. They would often see Confucianism and Christianity as not merely compatible, but as one completing the other.
Mhm.
Right?
Mhm.
So, the arrival of Christianity is like part of God's work, delivering, the final piece of the puzzle to a Japanese people who have a very special role or mission on the global stage.
Who have
Um,
something to give Christianity back.
yes, right.
Yeah.
So you see, back to our earlier part of our conversation, right? There's this cultural chauvinism of the
Yeah.
West versus that of Japan, and each civilization trying to assert itself in the face of the other. It's very interesting, but I want to get back to this idea of um, the divinity within, because I
Yeah.
think this would be really interesting and probably interesting to your audience. Um, so um, I, I'll talk about this through the lens of the Japanese Unitarian Christian who I've studied the most and appreciate the most, and that's Ebina Danjo. So Ebina Danjo is sort of our exemplar for this topic. He was born in 1856, died in the late 1930s, 1936, 1937. And he was famous for, as I mentioned, having the first big public debate, Japanese public debate in Christian theology over the deity of Christ. He published a lot of magazines. He had a magazine called Shinjin, and he published this really provocative article. I think this was 1902, called "The Doctrine of the Trinity in My Religious Consciousness." Really fascinating. But ultimately, for him, he not only dispenses, with the Trinity, and he does this for very interesting historical reasons and philosophical reasons, but he ends up not looking toward, this stained glass tradition, these creeds. That's not the kind of Christianity he's interested in. What he is interested in is the direct presence of God in his life. That is what is most important to him. He sees things like historical Christian doctrines, the Bible, all of this should be read in light of the Holy Spirit's guidance. Um, and it's interesting why he would say these things. I think there are Confucian reasons why he's drawn to this mode of Christian living, but there's also biblical, very Christian reasons why he's drawn to it as well. But first, on the Confucian reasons. So, um, so Confucianism. I'm assuming your audience isn't going to be too familiar with all of this, so I'll try to simplify it as much as possible. But everything I say is about to be a gross
Mhm.
oversimplification. Um, so there are sort of two basic schools of what we call Neo-Confucianism. So there's classical Confucianism in China, and then in around the year 1000 through the 1200s, there develops in China something called Neo-Confucianism. They don't call themselves that. That's what scholars call them, Neo-Confucianism. This is a revitalization of Confucianism in light of Buddhist metaphysics, to put it simply. Um, and this Neo-Confucianism also takes hold in Japan. And there are ultimately two forms of this Neo-Confucianism that we can talk about. One we would call Jushi school. Jushi is a Chinese Neo-Confucian, and then there's the school of Wang Yang Ming. And and it's even probably a little bit of a misnomer to call them schools, but that's how we'll simplify it. So Jushi's way of doing Neo-Confucian comes over to Japan, where it's called Shushigaku, and Wang Yang Ming's way of doing Confucianism comes over to Japan, and it's called Yomegaku. So if you read Ebina Danjo's writings, you can see him. He praises Yomegaku multiple times and calls it a very spiritual Confucian school. And remember, he thinks that Confucianism and Christianity are not just compatible, but they're brought to completion in one another. Though he does say that the Christian revelation is superior in many ways. So this kind of Yomegaku Neo-Confucianism is a precursor, which lays the groundwork and ultimately gets completed in the revelation of Jesus. But pertinent to this particular discussion about the divinity within and how and the way that he approaches things like the Bible. So Yomegaku prioritizes this inner principle within all of us, that in Chinese we would call Li. So there's this heavenly pattern, if you will, in all people, which in the Yomegaku interpretation or interpretation of Wang Yangming, it is a fully formed virtuous nature. Okay, so this is a gross oversimplification, but the rival Shishigaku school would really prioritize studying the classics.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So, you want to be a good scholar, you want to be a good person, you want to be a good human being. Confucianism is predicated largely or interested largely in moral development. Okay. So if you want to develop morally, according to the Shishigaku school, you're going to study the classics. The Yomegaku school is going to appreciate the classics, but really prioritize this fully formed moral nature that all of us are born with, that heaven endows us with. So, someone from the Yomegaku tradition might say, why do I need to learn how to be moral by studying the classics, all of these old texts, when I have within me a fully formed virtue? Right? I have all of the tools that I need. What I need to do is to look within. And when I consult the heavenly pattern within, that's how I can become enlightened and ultimately morally develop. So this is the background for Ebina Danjo, the Christian. He says, why do I need to rely on ancient texts when I have God's presence here in my life? I have the Holy Spirit here in me. Jesus had the Holy Spirit in him, guiding him. So that should be what that should be what I should focus on. This isn't to say that the Bible for someone like Ebina Danjo is, just throw it out completely. There's nothing to learn from it. But something that the Yomegaku school would say, that Wang Yangming himself, in China said, he would say, the Kongzi of the classic, Kongzi, that's Confucius. Okay, he would say that the Kongzi of the classics is important, but don't neglect the Kongzi within.
Mm-hmm.
Right, so you can see
it's almost like logos, right? Is pretty similar, right?
Yes, yeah,
like the and internal a logoi spermaticoi within each of us, or
yes,
something like that.
yeah, that's right. And there's actually a lot of very interesting parallels between Confucianism and Stoicism. We can maybe talk about that sometime. But ultimately, you can see this kind of background pattern for Ebina as how this translates into this Christian context. He has all of these Protestant missionaries demanding, you need to believe that God created the earth in 6 literal days, as it says right here on this page.
Right.
You need to believe that, and all this. So he instead, turns inward and says, I'll read the Bible, but only in light of the Holy Spirit's guidance in my life. The Bible is not the be all end all for Christians. It's secondary to the divine light of God in the life of the believer. He and this actually kind of colors his whole, critique of things like the doctrine of the Trinity as well, because he didn't see Christian doctrine as this thing which could be just set down and contained in the pages of a book, and that was it. He thought that was a real a limited, myopic version of what Christianity really had to offer. For him, the books of the Bible, for example, those were written by Paul. Well, these were historical documents that are written to a certain group of people, uneducated people. Paul therefore had to communicate in a certain way, very simply. So how could this contain really the entirety of Christian truth? In the same way, he would look at things like the doctrine of the Trinity through a historical lens and say, this is the byproduct of men of the time who were using the cultural and philosophical tools at their disposal to try to make sense of Christianity. So he would on the one hand use that as a way of critiquing the doctrine of the Trinity and other Christian doctrines. He would say, well, look, this is just the product of people of the age. But he would also use this fact to justify his own unique interpretation in history, right? If these guys can use what was available to them through their own cultural situatedness, then why can I not use the cultural heritage of Japan to help inform me about, what Christianity is or can be? So very, very fascinating way of thinking about and approaching Christianity. And I hope you understand, now what I mean when I said
it's a little bit both. Yeah.
Confucian reasons and clearly very Christian reasons predicated on the presence of the Holy Spirit in believers and things like that, which inspire the way that Ebina is a Christian.
That's very fascinating. He sounds like a really interesting, like it makes sense how he could be where he was, but it's still fascinating that there was someone like him. So then my last question for you this evening, and I warned you ahead of time that I was going to ask you this question, is it's hard not to study something deeply without learning something from it and appreciating something from it and taking something from it into your own life and your own spiritual life. Whether it's, I've done huge deep dives into, say, Origen of Alexandria. And while there's some parts of him that I'm happy to sort of leave behind, there's a lot of him that I like and that I feel like I've learned from and been happy to incorporate and things like that. And so I'm wondering what that's been like for you, delving into these Asian and Japanese religions and looking at Christianity in this context and Confucianism, Shintoism, Buddhism, and stuff like that, and how that's affected sort of your personal religious life and what parts of it you've admired and feel like you've gleaned something from.
Yeah. Fantastic question. And you did warn me about that beforehand. And I also returned with my own warning that I will certainly not have enough time, to talk about all of that, but I'll give you as much as I possibly can. So it's true, when we move in various intellectual waters, you can't help but imbibe the things that you appreciate and find useful and insightful. And that's certainly been my case at every stage in my scholarly journey. But it is clear that over the past, 5 to 6 years or so of being deeply immersed in the study of Japanese religions, all of the many traditions that we've talked about tonight, and then especially in studying Japanese Christianity, these topics have made a discernible mark, on me, certainly. So I identify as a Christian. As a Unitarian Christian, a non-Trinitarian Christian. I know we have that in common. But my background started out as American Protestant evangelical. And so one thing that's changed, I would say, is my sense of Christian exclusivism. So, when you grow up as a Protestant evangelical in America, there is some form of Christian exclusivism that is just strongly swimming in those waters, right?
Yeah.
In various flavors. But studying Japanese religions has caused me to rethink, that Christian exclusivism. I'm no longer an exclusivist, to put it simply. And there's, of course, various forms of Christian inclusivism, and we don't have time to get into all of that. But, I think when it comes to, my own personal reflections, and, we've been in historical waters. Now we're swimming in theology. When it comes to personally assessing whether or not I could accept someone as a Christian, or should I say, when it comes to thinking about whether I can accept somebody's or whether I think somebody's life and faith are acceptable to God, I've learned to prioritize far less the importance of holding to accurate doctrine about God rather than manifesting the kind of life in general that I think God is looking for in human beings. So that's been a big shift. Um, you know, I think when I was younger, I thought that, well, what religion's all about is, doing good, right? Being a good person, developing morally. I think that's just part of the whole, Sunday school ethic, right? That's drilled into you. And then at some point later in my life, I became, I don't know how it happened, right? But I became very interested in doctrine and in getting the metaphysics right, if you will. And I feel like I've come back down that mountain in some significant way. I kind of have in mind, if you've seen that meme that's all over X.
The bell curve, or
Yep.
yeah.
Right, and it's got the kind of funny looking simpleton on the one end, right, and then it goes up and comes down.
Yeah.
Or actually, I think it's the the enlightened guys at the bottom, and then it's the simpleton.
Yeah. Right. There's the simpleton on the low IQ end of the bell curve. There's like the angry mediocre man at the top of the bell curve, and then there's like the sage with like the hood on, who's supposed to be the super smart person. And the joke is that the super smart person and the super dumb person agree on a simple truth, where the person in the middle of the bell curve is confused and angry about something more complex.
Yeah, that's right. And what I'm about to say, I'm saying this from a theological perspective, not from a perspective in the study of religion. I used to believe that religion was about being a good person, and then I went up the hill and thought, this is about doctrine. It's about getting the doctrine right. And now I've come back down the hill, and for me, I think that what God, I believe in God. I think that what God is interested in is in the development of more people, and so that's been quite a shift for me. And again, I'm not saying that that's all of what religion is or what it amounts to, right? But in terms of why it's important to me and why it's something, and in terms of the focus, I think that God wants us to have. I think it's about the development of humans into the kinds of beings that He designed, that He's interested in. So that's been a really a big change and a slow process of transformation for me, and one inspired partially by studying the Kakure Christian that we spoke about. There was a time in my life where I would have looked at that sort of transformed Catholicism that these hidden Christians produced.
Simplified, mutated, condensed Catholicism. Yeah.
And there would have been a time where I would have thought they've really got it wrong. They really missed the point. God's not pleased. Probably an earlier, younger version of myself would have said something like that. Right. But, from another angle, you can look at these people who were, diligently, bravely pursuing God to the best of their ability. And I think there's something noble about that, and something about that God is deeply interested in. So it's those kind of historical encounters for me that along the way caused me to rethink different things. But the last part of my transformation, I guess, that we could speak about, is that studying Japanese religions eventually took me down the path of studying Confucianism, and studying the Confucianism of China, both classical Confucianism and what we talked about earlier, this Neo-Confucianism. And I realized over several years, I guess it's been half a decade or so, that I along the way had come to agree with many Confucian ideas, and I found many of the the classical Confucian philosophers to be very persuasive on a number of topics, and I also saw the compatibility of many of these ideas with the kind of Christianity that I've espoused. So I realized that I had become a Confucian myself. So I also identify as a Confucian. I am what scholars would call a multiple religious belonger. So I consider myself both a Christian, a Unitarian Christian, and also a Confucian. So in general, when I back up and I take a bigger picture view of things, I see that really my whole life. We started talking about why did you get into all of this, and I was that strange little boy, reading about all these topics. I see that my whole life has really been leading towards this understanding of the world that's just now taken shape more acutely in the last several years as a form of Confucian Christianity. So very interestingly, I find that I didn't set out to do this, and I was surprised by it. But I turned around and realized that in many ways, my thinking resembles the Unitarian Christians of Japan, where I see a compatibility between Confucianism and Christianity. So all of this has been a slow but significant change when I look back on it, and I feel like I'm just beginning to explore these areas of thought and this new way of engaging with Christianity and with religions in general. And I'm really looking forward to seeing where it goes. But it's definitely been productive and helpful so far. I wish we had time to get into all the particulars, or into the things about Confucianism that I find helpful. Maybe we can talk about that another time. But hopefully that was enough to answer your question.
No, that's fascinating. Thanks for sharing that, Kegan. I know that can be a very personal and difficult thing to share, and so I appreciate that, and that's very interesting and thought-provoking. Any other closing thoughts before we bring this to an end?
No, I think that's it. I really enjoyed our discussion. Hopefully your viewers have enjoyed it as well. I'm looking forward to maybe coming back another time and talking about some other things, and I'd love to have you over on my new channel, Exploring Religion, as well.
Yeah, I'd love to do that, and hopefully in less than 5 years this time.
Yeah.
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 All right.
Hopefully.
All right. Sounds good. Thank you, everyone, for listening.